of this new reform and questioning the church and Luther and Erasmus all impacted on the life of Henry VIII of England. When Martin Luther issued grievances against the church in 1517, Henry VIII was disgusted. He took it upon himself to personally repudiate the arguments of the Protestants. The Pope rewarded Henry with the lofty title of Defender of the Faith, and that title is still borne on the English coins. I don't know how many of them realise it was against Luther and Protestantism, since they all became Protestant, but they kept that title. Barely a decade, 10 years after, the very same Henry VIII would break decisively with the Catholic Church. He would accept the role of supreme head of the Church of England and dissolve the nation's monasteries, absorbing and redistributing the massive property as he saw fit.
Redistributing. Yeah.
Through early signs of anti-clericalism had surfaced in England by 1520s, Catholicism still enjoyed widespread popular support. As for Henry VIII, he had no wish or need to break with the church. That's what he said himself. No need, because he already enjoyed substantial power over the English church and its income. And he had no wish, because he was personally very pious. It is believed by the Catholics that Henry VIII on his deathbed returned to the Catholic Church. The Protestants would probably disagree with that, but they all agree that he was very pious. By 1527, Henry had a big problem. His first marriage to Catherine of Aragon had failed to produce a son and an heir to the throne. Now, Catherine of Aragon had been betrothed to the Henry VII's eldest son, Arthur, when she was 8 years old. And obviously she didn't come over and get married to him. She got married by proxy. They held a marriage ceremony. And one of the quaint things in the Catholic Church, for a marriage to be a sacrament, they must consummate the marriage. They must have sex. So instead of that bit, one of the courtiers went up to the bed and put his boot on the bed, and that was to suggest that they had completed the marriage ceremony. But anyway, when Catherine came over with Arthur, he was only 16 and he wasn't that well. Now here's where the trouble came. Catherine said they never did have sex, and our modern day historians said not possible. But they had a great deal of different ideas about having sex. They thought that if a man had sex, every time he had sex, he lost some of his masculinity and it weakened him. So it isn't beyond the bounds that if he was weak, he wouldn't have had sex. But however, that has never been resolved, and it is the basis of the whole of the history of England. Did Catherine of Aragon have sex with Arthur? Now, when Arthur died, Henry VIII was younger than Catherine of Aragon, but he agreed to marry her. But because she was his brother's wife, you weren't allowed to marry your brother's wife. It was regarded a little bit like incest. But to get over that problem, they went to the Pope and asked for the Pope to give Henry a dispensation to marry his brother's wife. Even though Catherine said, I did not sleep with him, I did not have sex with him, they said still, just in case, we'll get the dispensation from the Pope. This was to cause him a great deal of problem, because he'd got a dispensation to marry her. So Henry had also been infatuated at this stage. Now, they had a great wedding, Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII, and he became to the throne, the more great wedding celebrations, when he was 18. He ascended the throne. And they were very happily married for 20 years. And she had 8 pregnancies, one of which and she gave birth to a stillborn son. Later on, Henry, in his superstitions, believed that this was a sign from God that he was displeased with him breaking the idea of marrying his brother's wife. But more important than that, he had become infatuated with one of his wife's ladies-in-waiting called Anne Boleyn. Now, Henry also is in the same position with Anne Boleyn as he was with Catherine of Aragon, because Henry also had an affair with Anne Boleyn's sister Mary. Now the historians don't know whether Mary was older than Anne or younger than Anne, but it is considered, I suppose, because he had an affair with Mary first, that Mary was the older Boleyn. At this time, nobody knew what was going to happen. Nobody knew that Anne was going to become queen. So the people who said she deliberately schemed her way to become queen have no sense of the history of the time. The history of the time, there was no such thing as divorce, and it was the king had many mistresses, and to be a mistress of the king was to get very rich and be very powerful. So to be a mistress to the king was a good honour, and Henry wasn't expecting that Anne wouldn't give in to him. She wouldn't have sex with him. Well, Catherine of Aragon claimed her problem was that she didn't have sex with Arthur. Anne Boleyn's problem was that she wouldn't have sex. She kept saying, what about my honour? What about my honour? Now, obviously the people against her would say she was only scheming. That was part of her plan to become Queen of England. But I doubt very, very much. I think myself that Anne Boleyn was a courtier in France. She came back to the court of Henry VIII, where she was a young girl. She was full of French ways and French models. She was charming, she was witty, and she had a very good relationship with Henry Percy. Henry Percy was a very important noble. So when Henry VIII decided, he took her fancy and he decided to have her as his mistress, she claimed that she was already engaged to marry Henry Percy. Henry Percy was very young too. They were about, in their 20s, young couple, madly in love. And who was running the kingdom then was Wolsey, was the most important man at the time in the kingdom. So when he heard that they claimed to be in love and going to marry Percy, he called down Percy's father. And Percy's father owed money to the crown. And Wolsey said, if you don't stop this marriage, we will call in our debt. So the father said that he could not marry Anne Boleyn because she was already engaged to another woman. He didn't know about it. They rushed up this engagement, I imagine, because we don't have any documentation to prove this. The end of it was that Henry Percy was removed from court, and Anne Boleyn was sent to her castle in Havre, which was away from the lovely card-playing, dancing, happy court, into a dull castle with nothing to do. And she did say, she knew Wolsey had done this, and she's reported of saying, if ever I can do him a bad deed, I will. Now coming to her castle and sending her flowers was the person who caused the breakup of her relationship with Henry Percy, Henry VIII. She was a young girl in love with Henry Percy. This old man came offering her gifts and his undying love. But the more she said no, the more he wanted it. And she said, no, I only have sex with the man I marry. I can't be having sex with you, my honour. What about my honour? But of course, nothing like making them want it more to say no. So he was determined to have it. Now, as it actually happened, she did eventually sleep with him. She was pregnant with his child when he eventually did marry her. But Anne encouraged the king's attention. Now, the person who said that is the historian who sees Anne Boleyn as the villain. But shrewdly, again he's put in the shrewdly, refused to become his mistress, setting her sights on a higher goal. I doubt it. She's not back in the time. So Henry asked Pope Clement VII to grant him a divorce from Catherine. Now that was the norm. If you were rich enough, even in our day and age, Prince of Monaco was able to arrange an annulment for her daughter. If you were rich enough and had enough power, you could do that. And they were often doing that. So he expected to get a divorce from Catherine. He argued that the marriage was against God's will, due to the fact that she had briefly been married to Henry's late brother Arthur. Under other circumstances, it wouldn't have been too difficult for the England's king to get a papal dispensation to set aside his first wife and marry another in order to produce a male heir. There was a clear understanding among the princely houses of Europe that the continuation of the dynasty was a ruler's #1 priority, and obviously women were not considered a safe bet to have as monarchy. It had to be the son. But timing was not on Henry's side, because that same year, that was 1527, the imperial troops of the Holy Roman Empire, that's Charles V. Catherine of Aragon was his aunt. So the imperial troops attacked and destroyed Rome itself, forcing Pope Clement VII to flee the Vatican through a secret tunnel and to take shelter in the castle of St. Angelo. At the time, the title of Holy Roman Emperor belonged to King Charles V of Spain, Catherine of Aragon's beloved nephew. With the papal nearly entirely under imperial sway, you see, Clement VII couldn't say no, so he started dallying tactics. Clement VII was not inclined to grant Henry a divorce from the emperor's aunt, but he didn't want to completely deny Henry either, so he stretched the negotiations with the cardinal's minister, Cardinal Thomson Wolsey. He stretched out the negotiations for many years, even as Henry grew increasingly frustrated. Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell found a Protestant solution. It was the clergyman Thomas Cranmer and the king's influential advisor Thomas Cromwell, both Protestants, who built a convincing case that England's king should not be subject to the Pope's jurisdiction. Eager to marry Anne, Henry appointed Cranmer as the Archbishop of Canterbury, after which Cranmer quickly granted Henry's divorce from Catherine. In June 1533, the heavily pregnant Anne Boleyn, see, she didn't mind her honour for too long, was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony. But the people of England never liked her. Parliament's passage of the Act of Supremacy in 1534 solidified the break from the Catholic Church and made the king the supreme head of the Church of England, with Cranmer and Cromwell in positions of power and a Protestant queen by the king's side. Now again, that's older historians saying that Anne was Protestant. At that stage, many people were just waiting to see what way the things would turn out. She wasn't. She probably, it was fashionable to like the new learning and Erasmus and those sort of things, but she hadn't given up her Catholic faith. And all of those were all waiting to see what way the tide would turn. Cranmer was made King of England by adopting some of the lessons of continental Reformation, including, this might seem trivial to us, translating the Bible into English. But at that time, the sacred language was Latin. Only in my time has Latin been changed. To say the Mass in English would have been considered a heresy at that time, when the Protestants started saying the Mass in English. Now we're saying, we've caught up with Luther. By about Vatican II, we caught up with Luther. And a lot of the things we said we should do, we are now doing. If he'd come back and saw the Catholic Church, he would probably think it was his church, with the exception that the priests aren't married. But give it time. The Crown also moved to dissolve England's monasteries and take control of the church's vast property. Now, a lot of the monasteries were very worldly and very rich, but also they did most of the caring for the sick and educating the children. And they were the only kind of state services the poor people had. This was the greatest redistribution of property in England since the Norman conquest in 1066. All the property reverted to the crown, and Henry used the windfall to reward his councillors, both Protestant and Conservative, for their loyalty. Even Catholics are extremely tempted by the opportunity to increase their land holdings with the former monastic property. Anne Boleyn, of course, would fail to produce the desired heir, though she gave birth to a daughter who would become Elizabeth I. And that daughter was the greatest monarch England ever had, and England is called the Golden Age of England under Elizabeth I. By 1532, Henry had fallen for another lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour. That time after her former ally Cromwell helped engineer her conviction of adultery. incest and conspiracy against the king, Anne was executed. She said she'd bring Wolsey down, and she did. Wolsey was, all his property was taken from him. He was arrested, and he was being brought to the Tower of London when he died. Otherwise, he might have been executed as well. He's famous for saying, "If only I had served my God as I served my king," because Wolsey made Henry VIII great. In October 1537, Jane Seymour gave birth to Henry's first male heir, the future King Edward VI, before dying of complications from childbirth 2 weeks later. The fact that she died made Henry say he's the only one she really loved. For the rest of Henry's life, evangelical and conservative fractions wrestled for influence. They were the people who wanted the new religion and Erasmus and the new reform, often with murderous results. After Henry's death in 1547, his son's brief reign, he was only about 9 years old, would be dominated by the Protestant councillors who were able to introduce a much more radical reformation into England. It is considered that Henry died with the Catholic rites and reconciled to the Catholic Church. But Edward died young in 1553, and his Catholic half-sister, Queen Mary I, who was the daughter of the persecuted Catherine of Aragon, would reverse many of the changes during her reign. She also put to death many of those Protestant bishops. 300 Protestants were burned to death in Mary's reign. Now, they were burnt to death in other reigns as well, but the Protestants, of course, hated Mary. They hated her because she wanted to marry Philip II of Spain. They didn't want to be under Spanish control, but they have named her ever since as Bloody Mary. It would be left to Queen Elizabeth I, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the ruler of England for nearly 50 years, to complete the reformation her father had begun. She wasn't very keen to do that. She was very Protestant, though they'd say, oh, she was the Protestant queen. She wasn't. She said, you know, there's only one Jesus. There must be a middle way. And she would have gone either Catholic or Protestant, except the Pope excommunicated her, and that pushed her into being a Protestant. As for Henry VIII, he remained a conservative Catholic with a personal hatred of Martin Luther for the rest of his life, despite the revolutionary changes effected on Luther's behalf. And that's the end of the divorce of Henry VIII.
The end.
The divorce is absolutely at the heart of the matter. Had there been no marital problems, I'm fairly certain there would have been no English Reformation, at least in Henry's lifetime.